In the chaos of World War II, where supply lines collapsed overnight and battles stretched for miles in every direction, survival often came down to improvisation. Medics couldn't rely on perfect conditions, clean gauze, or stocked field kits. Many times they didn't even have the basics. No sterile wraps, no surgical tools, and sometimes not even water that was safe to drink. But the wounded didn't stop coming, and bleeding didn't stop because supplies were low. What emerged out of that desperate reality was one of the most overlooked life-saving techniques in wartime history: the improvised field bandage made from scraps and trash. It sounds primitive today, but it saved thousands, and the principles behind it are still useful anywhere modern supplies fail. On the front lines, a soldier could bleed out in minutes, long before reaching a medic station. Standard bandages were consumed almost immediately during heavy fighting. Medics had no choice but to turn to whatever materials existed within arm's reach. Uniform rags became absorbent dressings, cotton undershirts were torn into strips, wool from overcoats became padding, and parachute silk, smooth, clean, and surprisingly sturdy, became one of the most valuable emergency materials. The process of turning these scraps into life-saving dressings was crude, but incredibly effective. The first priority was sterilization. Boiling was the gold standard. Soldiers heated water in steel pots, helmets, or even canteen cups, submerging torn cloth for at least 10 minutes. When fuel wasn't available, the next best method was fire itself. Medics held fabric close to the flames, not enough to burn, but enough to heat the fibers and kill surface bacteria. When all else failed, they reached for alcohol, iodine, or even whiskey, soaking cloth in anything with antiseptic properties. Paper became another unlikely hero. In the Pacific, medics noticed that ration-book pages, rice paper, and even cigarette wrappers were extremely absorbent when folded several layers thick. When sterilized with heat or alcohol, they performed almost like temporary gauze. They weren't meant to stay on long, but they could keep a wound clean and absorb enough blood to buy precious minutes or hours. Many soldiers made it to proper medical units only because a medic had grabbed a handful of paper and made it work. These techniques weren't random acts of desperation. They were rooted in practical microbiology. Heat kills pathogens. Salt water cleans wounds and reduces bacterial load. Alcohol disinfects on contact. Sunlight's ultraviolet rays help sterilize materials when there's nothing else available. All of this was understood by medics who had no access to labs or textbooks, only experience and necessity. Today, those same principles still apply to anyone living off-grid or handling an emergency without a proper first aid kit. A torn cotton shirt boiled for 10 minutes becomes a sterile bandage. A belt becomes a tourniquet. Paper towels sterilized with heat become absorbent wound pads. The technology hasn't changed. Only our dependence on convenience has. Once these improvised bandages were used, medics didn't discard them automatically. In the brutal efficiency of war, nothing was wasted unless it had to be. Used cloth bandages were boiled again, scrubbed with soap, dried in open air, and laid out under direct sunlight. That sunlight acted as a natural disinfectant, adding a layer of protection when antiseptics ran low. Binding those bandages required even more ingenuity. Medics used rifle slings, leather straps, torn webbing, and even vines in jungle environments. What mattered wasn't beauty or neatness, it was pressure. Compression slowed blood loss, stabilized the wounded, and often meant the difference between survival and tragedy. In freezing conditions, snow itself became a tool. Soldiers used packed snow to slow swelling and reduce bleeding before applying their makeshift dressings. In desert heat, bandages dried instantly, making repeated sterilization cycles fast and efficient. Every environment forced creativity, and medics adapted because the wounded didn't have the luxury of waiting. What makes this lost technique so valuable today is not only its effectiveness, but its philosophy. Survival wasn't about having perfect gear, it was about understanding principles. Clean the wound as best as possible. Apply something sterile and absorbent. Keep it in place with pressure. If you can do those three things, you can save a life with almost anything. The soldiers of World War II proved that under the worst conditions imaginable. Modern preppers and off-grid enthusiasts can, really learn from this mindset. A simple kit containing a pot, some rags, salt and a lighter can actually recreate the entire wartime method. With those tools alone, you can produce sterile bandages indefinitely. It's not romantic or glamorous, but it's real, tested, and rooted in a time when innovation came from necessity, not convenience. The improvised trash bandage isn't just a relic of war. It's a testament to human ingenuity. It proves that survival often depends less on what you possess and more on what you know. When everything else falls apart, the ability to improvise, to turn scraps into life-saving tools, becomes, priceless. If you value forgotten survival knowledge that bridges history with modern realities, make sure you subscribe to Untold Battle. Share this with someone who understands that sometimes the smallest bit of knowledge can save a life, just as it did on the battlefields of the 1940s.